Hello, team. Welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. This is Ukraine War, Kursk update, giving you the ups and downs as to what is going on in the Ukrainian incursion into, or invasion, or maneuver into Russian territory in Kursk. Now, what has to be remembered as I talk about this is that Russia is putting Ukraine under immense pressure in Turetsk and New York, particularly, and around Pokrovsk, towards Pokrovsk. So the Russians are still making gains there, and the Ukrainians are still under huge pressure. But there are some rumors that, or some claims that, the Ukrainians have pulled troops from those areas to help support the attack into Kursk. And there are also claims that the Russians are taking troops from those areas to help defend Kursk. So all sorts going on. Now, the map, this is 5 hours from the update from Andrew Perpetua and his team, but he has the area looking like this. There were claims of the Ukrainians moving in this direction and being close to Belaya and Belitsia here, but it looks like the Russians have done a counterattack to push the Ukrainians back in this area, while the Ukrainians are making hay while the sun shines in the northwest here towards Rilsk. Now, the dimensions of this salient are sort of 30, 31 kilometers, depending on where you take it from. Uh, Deep and 40 odd kilometers, so 42 kilometers wide. That's to the edge of the grey zone. Again, 5 hours out of date and possibly not as it's only these maps are only as good as the open source intelligence sources are, and they're always going to lag behind what's actually happening. Now, just when you then go down to the Prokrovsk area, to the Avdiivka front, which always looks bigger, I think, than the front that we've just been looking at. Actually, this is only 23 kilometers wide and 31 kilometers deep, so that is considerably smaller than the Kursk incursion. And when we look at what has just been said, so it turns out that Sersky has just come out, the commander in chief of the Ukrainians, and said that Ukrainian forces have taken more than 1,000 square kilometers in the Kursk region, and that far outstrips what has happened in the Pokrovsk direction. It's almost double of what I have tracked so far, says Tendar. Reminder, my maps are adjusted primarily by visual confirmation. So Tendar and indeed, any OSINT mappers like Andrew Perpetua will be, as I've just mentioned, dependent on visually confirmed or visual sources. But there's an awful lot else going on, and okay, Sersky could be over egging the successes of the Ukrainians. Yep, could be some PR involved in that, but also they could have achieved an awful lot more than we are aware of. So, reminder, my maps are adjusted primarily by visual confirmation and reflect the lower or conservative end of estimated Ukrainian gains. General Sersky's statements are also in range with Russian claims. So it's interesting. So there are some Russian claims that the Ukrainians are much further on than they are, but there's also the theory that the Russians claim these Ukrainian advances and then show evidence that the Ukrainians aren't there, and then say, look, we've pushed them back. So there's quite a bit of psyopsy type thing going on with what Russians claim. So even if the Russians do claim that the Ukrainians are much further on than we think, it's not always the case that they are. There is this thing of enemy attestation whereby if the enemy is claiming that you or the other side is doing well and has made an advance here, then you usually think that has a better value than your own side making these claims that could be over-egged. But then the enemy or the Russians here could be doing that for their own particular agenda. Right. Now, something just before I go on, it's worth popping into No Reports. He's on holiday at the moment. I don't know if it's just him alone or a team, but certainly him or they are on holiday from yesterday, so they are posting less at the moment, still keeping up to date on what's going on in Kursk. But I think it's the mapping that he says won't be updated daily, but it could be that he maps Kursk more than anywhere else on his whole sort of mapping side of things. So go and check out what No Reports says throughout the day, adding a bit nuggets to what goes on in particular in Kursk on that Kursk thread. Now, something I actually meant to report, I think yesterday, was that Putin has replaced Gerasimov with the FSB chief Bortnikov in the Kursk operation. So, a bit of history on Gerasimov. He's commander in chief. He went missing for quite a long time after it. Well, there were claims that there was a strike in Crimea that took place, and there were claims that Gerasimov was there and was killed. Gerasimov then went missing for months and months, and as the person in charge of the whole war effort, that was kind of weird. And then we saw him voting with Shoigu in the elections, and maybe one other medal giving ceremony, or not quite a ceremony, but event to some soldiers. And you look at him thinking, oh, you're not moving very well. He didn't say anything. He followed what Shoigu did at the voting thing, and he looked like he might be carrying some kind of issue. Some people talking about brain issues, heart attacks, injury from that strike that he was reportedly in. And then since then, we've not really seen him at all. So for the guy that's supposed to be in charge of the whole war effort, you'd expect to be seeing him all the time, like we see and hear of Sersky, comments from Sersky and Zaluzhny when he was in charge, and indeed Gerasimov when he was more active earlier on in the war. But since that moment, I think he is carrying, personally, I think the probability is high that Gerasimov is carrying some issue as a result of that strike or some medical issue or something. He is absent for a reason. It has been long thought that he's due for a replacement. When Shoigu was moved sideways and Belousov came in, one was thinking, right, Gerasimov's going to be next, but he seems to be holding on, but not doing anything. And now we see him replaced in the Kursk region by an FSB chief. This is incredibly important and could show a, I think it might be too embarrassing for Putin to admit that there's an issue with Gerasimov, and so it's a kind of subtle moving of Gerasimov sideways, starting with the Kursk region and maybe moving on further. Um, so here's a quote from an article from the Daily Wrap saying Putin likely appointed Bortnikov as the head of the counter-terrorist operation because Bortnikov had previously proven himself to be an effective manager during crises that threatened Russian domestic stability and Kremlin regime. So what they've done is they've called this whole area, and surrounding areas like Bryansk, as part of the CTO, this counter-terrorist, anti-terrorist operation. Counter-terrorist operation that is interesting of itself. I mean, it's not really that; it's a war zone. The Institute for the Study of War (ISW) explains that appointing Bortnikov as a commander of the anti-terrorist operation indicates that quote Putin was dissatisfied with how the Russian military command handled the situation in the Kursk region, and there's this idea that there's been reported widely that Gerasimov has lied to Putin. And I was talking about this yesterday. How much does Putin really know? If he doesn't have access to the internet because so Putin famously thinks the internet is a CIA conspiracy. So he doesn't have a smartphone. He doesn't use the internet. How does he himself personally verify claims that are being fed to him by those around him? He has to kind of go to those around him to question those around him, and he's basically the victim, arguably the victim of a curated information bubble over which he has very little control, and yet he's the one at the top making these big decisions. So there is this idea that Putin, garbage in, garbage out, might not know as much as you think, and is victim to the vagaries of those around him. Now, this article says the day before, the chief of Russian armed forces, Valery Gerasimov, lied to Putin while reporting the situation in the Kursk region. So this was, I think, in public. During an extraordinary briefing, he told the dictator that about 1,000 Ukrainian armed forces soldiers had entered the territory of the Russian Federation. The day before, the Russian Ministry of Defense had announced the same losses for the Ukrainian army in the Kursk region. According to Bloomberg sources, Russian intelligence knew 2 weeks in advance that Ukraine was planning an attempt to break through the border in the Kursk region. However, Gerasimov ignored all the warnings and decided not to bother President Putin with this information. So you've got this chap Bortnikov. Some of Kremlin's political elite believe that Bortnikov to be Putin's successor. He has been accused, among other things, of participating in the poisoning of Alexander Litvinenko in London in 2006. Bortnikov made it his goal to restore the Soviet order in the special services, indicating that discipline was not what it once was. So interesting. This source, called Beefeater, guardian of facts, so on and so forth, part of NATO, etc., etc. But says another daily roundup of Russian Telegram chatter. Read the disclaimer, please. Okay, Bortnikov instead of Gerasimov. The real reason for introducing the CTO, so this counterterrorism scenario, has been revealed. It turns out that it was needed in order to de facto appoint Bortnikov instead of Gerasimov to liberate the Kursk region in the CTO regime. So calling it counterterrorism isn't because they're worried about terrorism and they label it such, but it just gives them the opportunity to replace Gerasimov with someone who is a counterterrorism guy. But this is, as mentioned, possibly a way of just sidelining Gerasimov. Putin has likely appointed the FSB chief Bortnikov as commander of a counterterrorism operation following the Ukrainian army's invasion of Kursk region. His appointment as commander indicates that Putin was dissatisfied with the Russian military command handling Kursk, so on and so forth. So, same information there, a lot of it coming from the ISW. Gerasimov was not present at the last meeting with the security forces, which is, somewhat controversial. Lots there about the State Duma and so on and so forth. But I think it's a really super important event or happening there with regard to the military hierarchy in Russia. So The Economist is reporting that the Ukrainian General Staff has reported the transfer of Russian troops to the Kursk region of Kharkiv and Donbass. So remember yesterday I was talking about how one of the reports in The Guardian citing a Ukrainian commander or Ukrainian source saying that actually they hadn't yet really seen the Russians move troops from the Eastern Front Line, which is supposedly one of the main objectives for this Kursk operation. And then we had lots of Russian sources claiming that had indeed happened. And so I was saying there's this contradiction here that it looks like the Russians probably have moved resources from the Eastern Front Line. Well, anyway, in connection with the offensive of the Ukrainians in the Kursk region, the Russian command began to transfer troops in the direction from Kharkiv and Donbass. This is reported by The Economist with reference to an anonymous source in the General Staff of Ukraine. So again, that's kind of, as mentioned, going against what had previously been said. Quote, their commanders are not idiots. They are moving forces, but not as fast as they would like. They know we can't stretch logistics 80 or 100 kilometers, the source said. According to the interlocutor of the publication, the AFU sent the most combat-ready units to the Kursk region. According to him, the Ukrainian military managed to penetrate deep into the region up to 40 kilometers, as previously mentioned. Right. Then we go on to Mick Ryan, the retired Australian general, giving another update to what his ideas of the strategy and the objectives and the adaptations are. He says the Ukrainian Operation Kursk is almost 1 week into execution as the Russians slowly but surely redeploy forces to seal off the breach in their border and attempt to push the Ukrainians back into Ukraine. It is worth pondering the options the Ukrainians might have once they reach their limit of exploitation. So, like all military operations, this will have been planned as a multi-phase operation, including the prelude shaping operations. These would have included intelligence collection, force preparation, deception, operational security, logistics, and other aspects necessary to prepare the Ukrainian force for battle. Other phases will have been planned, including the break-in and breakthrough battles, ongoing exploitation and consolidation phases. These phases will have a range of forces and support elements applied to each. The Ukrainians' first phase, the break-in and breakthrough, are complete. They are currently in the exploitation phase. Many operations normally include a limit of exploitation governed by terrain, logistics, and reaction of the enemy, as well as the objectives of the operation. What might be Ukraine's strategic options once they reach their limit of exploitation? I think they probably have 3 options. Each will have minor branch plans as well as opportunities and risks, he says. Just publishing my last video. There you go. And option 1, so, is for the Ukrainians to consolidate on the terrain they have seized so far and then defend it until some form of negotiation takes place. This is the highest risk option because the Ukrainian dispositions feature multiple small salients which would easily be cut off and destroyed by even semi-competent Russian commanders. The high probability of losing a large number of forces in this scenario makes it a strategic and political liability. Ukraine could lose battalions and brigades as well as artillery, electronic warfare, and air defense if it could not afford to lose. This option, should it go bad, would also squander the very positive strategic messaging that has been generated by the Ukrainian surprise attack into Russia. The objective for this operation would be to continue posing a significant risk to Russian sovereignty and critical assets and constitute a draw for Russian forces from Ukraine. It might also provide Ukraine some leverage if forced into negotiations in the near future. It is questionable whether the downside risks of the option are worth the return, however. Option two, the second option, is for the Ukrainians to undertake a partial withdrawal from the territory it has seized back to ground it has more that is more defensible. This is a medium risk option with a decreased risk of option one. Then this would rely on Ukrainians conducting a withdrawal into pre-designated terrain that is easier to defend, requires a small quantity of troops to defend, or smaller, sorry, and is able to be supported by fires, logistics, and other functions more effectively. This option would also ensure that the troops could be reallocated after the operation to other activities, be they defending in the Donbass or subsequent cross-border attacks into Russia, where there is an opportunity to do so. Option two allows Ukraine to maximize the political and strategic benefits of the strategic shock while reducing the risks of losing the combat force. It would also require large numbers of combat and support troops to defend the seized Russian territory and would demand a major engineer effort to build minefields and other obstacles, trench lines, and deep bunkers and logistic storage locations. The objective for this option would be to continue posing a risk to Russian sovereignty, comprise an ongoing withdrawal for Russian forces from Ukraine, and to give Ukraine some leverage if forced into negotiations in the near future. The humiliation of Putin and his military is also important. The risks of the opportunity might be worth the potential gains. The third option, so option number three for Ukraine, would be to fully withdraw back to the international border between Russia and Ukraine. This would permit Ukraine to maximize the political and strategic benefits of operation into Russia while preserving a large body of experienced combat troops that might be employed on subsequent offensive operations in 2024 and 2025. By choosing this option, the Ukrainians would be messaging to the Russians that, quote, we can invade, hurt your country if we choose, but we have no wish to occupy our neighbors. While the Ukrainian invasion may allow Putin to reinforce his point to Russians about the threat from NATO, he also appears weak because he was not able to punish those who conducted the operation in Kursk. The objective for this operation would be to humiliate Putin, persevere Ukrainian combat forces while sending a strategic message to Ukraine supporters that they can go on the offensive and do so in a manner which does not pose an existential risk to the ground forces conducting the operation. Given the preservation of Ukrainian forces under this option, it will probably be one that gives Zelensky the best domestic political boost and improvement in Ukrainian morale. So remember what I've said before is the overall objective for Ukraine in this war is to get back their territory. So territorial gain is your number one priority up here, but you do other things that may see you even lose territory in order to eventually get territory, depending on what you're talking about and where you're talking about it. So, because underneath that objective are these other objectives, and one very important one is not to lose as many troops as possible, to minimize casualties. Now, the Russians don't have that as an objective. Their objective appears to be to take Ukrainian territory, but underneath that, minimization of losses is not there, is absent. Whereas that is a metric of success for the Ukrainians. So when they're looking at something like the Kursk objective, they always need to be thinking about their objective there in terms of also not losing troops. And if they go and take as much territory as possible and then dig in and the Russians attack them, then that will be attritional for them. And so that might not fit in with their objectives, really. So withdrawing all the way back to the border might end up being a preferable outcome for them, having done all that they've done and maybe messing up and mining the area for the Russians and ruining logistics and taking out train tracks and gas pipelines or whatever. They might just go back to where they started and then take those troops and who have been now, if there's some new, although the idea is that they're using some of their more experienced troops, but they could also be bedding in some new units that have been created, send them down to Pokrovsk to continue defending there, hopefully having drawn a load of Russian troops up from the Eastern Front as well. Yeah, the range of factors will have an influence on a range of factors will have an influence on which option the Ukrainian government chooses. These factors include how the Russians change their force posture in Ukraine, including Donbass, the Russian response in Kursk, domestic and international political considerations, and the sustainability of the operation itself. Now, Emil Castelhaimi, a Finnish analyst here, saying the Kursk offensive is a situational update. The operation has been ongoing for almost a week. During the last days, Ukraine has not made very significant progress, but they have started solidifying their positions in the newly captured areas. So think about those three options that Mick Ryan talked about, which is one, you know, consolidating where they're at right now, no matter where they're at. And some of these might be these very thin along the roads, up towards certain other objectives. If the Russians start stalling the Ukrainians, they might decide to just, okay, let's dig in here, or withdraw to better defensive areas they can defend more effectively and efficiently with what they have, or withdraw all the way back, with maybe achieving certain other goals in there with logistics and so on and so forth. Okay, so with that in mind, as expected, says Castelhaimi. In fact, I might keep that map up and just cycle through this. So, as expected, it took Russia a few days to transfer units to the area, but they will likely continue to do so in the coming days. With their current forces, the Russians have managed to prevent any more serious breakthroughs from happening. Local counterattacks have started. Russians are still likely holding some central and eastern parts of Syria, although there are claims that they aren't at the moment, so that could be called into question. This is from yesterday, bear in mind. In Operation, while the Ukrainians are continuing operations in the area, in Martinovka, Russians counterattacked and likely pushed Ukrainians out of the village. Reportedly, Ukrainians are trying to get it back. So there are claims that they have got that back. So, but, pinch of salt and all that. In the direction of Koronovo, Ukrainians have not been able to enter the city, at least not with a large force. There are some uncertainties in the zone of control, especially on the western and northern flanks of the area of operation. So there are claims actually in Koronovo that the Ukrainians are possibly sort of flanking it and having some success there. For example, no report says from 10 hours ago, confirmation of Ukrainian presence in Zuravi, east of Koronovo. Since yesterday, the air view has stepped up offensive actions. Just to give you an idea of that, offensive actions to flank Koronovo and advance north of this area. It is likely that Kramyanoye and Kalinov, which are located in close vicinity to Zuravi, do not hold any Russian presence. So you can see there's Koronovo there. The Ukrainians may be trying to flank it to the east and go up north of it. But anyway, worth bearing that in mind when listening to Castelhaimi here, because that's to say that the Ukrainians are all the way over here, not just down here. So it depends on how recent his mapping is. Anyway, Russia still doesn't have a solid control of the front line at the state or the state border. For example, yesterday evening, multiple Russian channels reported Ukrainians operating deep in the direction of Belitsa. Sabotage and reconnaissance groups still seem to go through elsewhere too. General situation of the Kursk offensive doesn't look particularly good. After a week of fighting, neither Koronevo nor Sudzha are fully in Ukrainian control, and the Russians have likely blocked the northern direction. This isn't a very desirable situation. So this is quite well, not damning, but it is maybe a realistic, maybe a negative evaluation of what the Ukrainians have achieved. However, for Ukraine, the situation isn't particularly bad either. They are still holding on to most of the gained ground despite Russian counterattacks. Even the more Russian troops in the general area, Ukraine still holds the initiative. After more Russian reinforcements arrive, operational success is increasingly difficult to achieve, and there's less room for the element of surprise. Committing more troops also increases risks, especially as the situation in the eastern Ukraine is still difficult. That's quite an understatement, maybe. There have been Russian rumors about Ukraine soon launching. Good old Twitter always does this. There have been rumors about Ukraine soon launching an attack either towards Rilsk or Glushkovo. They would achieve some success there, but there would be a limited effect to the general situation. The most valuable places in the Kursk Oblast would still be safe. My main question is, It says Kestelhemi, what can Ukraine achieve if it spends more manpower and equipment to take the border villages in the Kursk direction? There's a limited amount of benefit to be gained by simply controlling more land. A larger land area would, of course, have more weight in possible peace negotiations in the future. But of course, the problem is, this is me speaking, they have to maintain control of that land because I don't think negotiations are going to happen next week, right? So that is definitely, something to consider. Even if Ukraine were to reach the Rilsk-Koronovo-Sudzha line, it would likely still be less valuable than many of the territories currently occupied by Russia in Ukraine. So a larger land area would, of course, have more weight in those negotiations, but, maintaining it's the issue. Some have argued that expanding the zone of control could force the Russians to shift their focus to Kursk at the expense of other directions because of political reasons. I'm not entirely convinced the Russians will do this, as there are other possible scenarios too. It's possible that Russians would try to freeze a front and let Ukraine stay in the occupied area, assuming that the issue of a few dozen towns and villages can be solved in future negotiations, as the priority is to achieve the set political goals inside Ukraine. So if the Russians move significant forces from the east and they leave themselves weak in the east, and then they take back that area in Kursk, but they could say, well, if we leave them in the east, we're going to continue taking land in the east. So we'll happily, I say scare quotes, happily let the Ukrainians take land in Kursk, but they're going to run out of the ability to take even more land. So if we put an amount of forces around there to stop them taking more land, then we can continue, making hay while the sun shines in the east. But yeah, in this situation, some additional Ukrainian forces would be tied to guard and hold the expanded secondary direction, while the fight in Donetsk, Zaporizhia, Luhansk, and Kharkiv would continue just as intensively. That's kind of my point I was just making. The Kursk offensive is increasingly beginning to look like a medium risk, medium reward operation. There's no massive game-changing objectives to be achieved, but there's also no likely catastrophes on the horizon. The best case scenarios for Ukraine would probably be the following. Russia decides it's not acceptable to leave any areas in Ukrainian hands and will divert significant resources, even from the most critical places, and get every square kilometre back despite the losses. Now, if Russia decides to do that, Ukraine's best chance is not to hit them on the ground, but to hit them through HIMARS and through the air with aviation, such that those long columns that we've seen, or a few of these columns that we've seen taken out, would happen more consistently. That could be the best route to Russian attrition there. This would severely attrit the Russians, ease the pressure in other directions, and maybe even make it possible for Ukrainians to improve the tactical situation locally in the east. However, as usual, the reality will most likely be somewhere in between. Regardless of whether the Ukrainians continue their advance, they have proved that the occupation of relatively large areas is no longer a privilege of Russia. The war is now even more concretely a war on Russian soil as well, and Russia must take this into account in many ways. Okay, so we have the idea also that's happening at the moment, or the fact that's happening, is that the Russians are looting these towns and villages that have lost power, that have been evacuated, or even taken. A reminder that Russian society is mainly held together by repression, not by a sense of citizens' responsibility. So there's a thread here by Chris Owicki. And that's really, by the way, why this person, Clements Vergin, is saying that is because at the beginning, when Ukraine was attacked by Russia, that didn't happen. There's a really interesting difference between Russia and Ukraine, where Ukraine, there was a sense of civic duty and togetherness that meant that when Russia attacked, there wasn't widespread looting. At least the looting was done by the Russian soldiers. The Ukrainians have attacked into Russia. They haven't looted the Russians, and the Russians have looted themselves. That is worthy of note. As Ukrainian forces advance in Kursk region, law and order in frontline Russian-held areas is reported to have collapsed completely. Rampant looting, quote, rampant looting is said to have broken out, being done by the Russians themselves, while local residents say they feel abandoned. The Telegram channel that Chris Owicki refers to often reports that in the border quote, in the border areas of the Kursk region where fighting has been going on all week, there are no police, no firefighters, no doctors, no representatives of the administration. According to official information, more than 76,000 people have left the settlements, most of them left on their own since there was no organized evacuation, despite the statements of the authorities, but there are still people there, mostly elderly. The channel says that, quote, the desertion of villages and towns has become a catalyst for rampant looting. The disorder is being carried out by the Russians themselves, though it isn't clear if opportunistic civilians or indisciplined soldiers are responsible. A local resident says, quote, they are robbing stores. There is a collapse in Koronovo. The Magnet supermarket pictured below was simply destroyed. There's no water, no gas, no electricity. There was no organized evacuation, and if there was, why didn't we hear anything about it? And in Lobanovka, an outlying area of Koronovo, according to the channel, quote, a similar situation exists in other border municipalities. It reports that, quote, Kursk residents are sure that representatives of regional administration, having abandoned people to their fate themselves, provoked the collapse of the border areas. Quote, currently, it is impossible to get through to the administration of the Koronovsky district of the Kursk region because, people are forced to self-organize in order to protect themselves and their property and essentially perform the functions of the state and law enforcement agencies. So this is fascinating. And then you get, actually, it's probably worth bringing in this chap now. So a Russian man from Sudzha in Kursk Oblast gives his opinions on the current situation. This is a chap from Sudzha. He says, there's a Ukrainian flag hanging on the city administration building. This is what he says as he walks through the town, one presumes. There are many soldiers and equipment. I thought about taking a photo, but then a soldier called me over. I presume a Ukrainian soldier. He checked my documents. He wasn't rude or anything, just said that filming wasn't allowed. I asked him what we should do now, what will happen. I thought this was quite interesting. He basically said, learn Ukrainian him and prepare for a referendum. This chap then says, I'm effing in shock. Honestly, I don't care anymore what flag we're under as long as it's peaceful. Wow, that's a real admission there. If our own can't protect us, so law enforcement, the soldiers, maybe at least Ukrainians can. Bye, he says. Wow. I know that's just anecdotal, but wow. Okay. Tendar then goes on to say Ukrainian armored vehicles were visually confirmed. I reported this earlier in a village down here, BTR 4, I think it was, 4E was seen down here, Ukrainian one, but then it was thought to have been captured. So this initially meant that people were drawing their maps with the Ukrainians having control far further to the east. So that's down here, like I was telling you about. And Tendar, among the many mappers, said that was the case, and then said, "Oh no, correction! Actually, that was a. It seems like that was a captured Ukrainian vehicle." So I've just jigged the map to reflect that. So that's one to watch. Sergei Sumleni here says, one thing I forgot to say. So by the way, if you don't know who he is, he's an Eastern European expert, founder of a European Resilience organization. So one thing I forgot to say, the FSB will get Ukrainian uniforms and demonstrably execute local Russians to create evidence of Ukraine's brutality. This is what NKVD, MGB and KGB did in the west of Ukraine to undercut support for the resistance, and later FSB did in Ichkeria. So the Russians got they've got some form in that sense, so be warned. Yes, and he's done a whole thread on removing Gerasimov from command over Kursk and how the FSB will therefore, be able to do some of these things more easily and exert more of a problematic control over Kursk and the area. Anyway, I won't go into that thread. Last thing I'll say, as I said this morning, is that Ukrainian Su-27s have been seen in Kursk airspace. Russia has apparently lost air superiority in that Kursk airspace, which would be fairly incredible if the case. So Ukrainian Su-27s operating around Kursk, probably in close air support mode. But pretty good for the Ukrainians there. But it's going to be interesting to see how this develops, as those analysts have pointed out. And just to give you the very latest on what Noel Reports has on his thread, reporting again about 1,000 square kilometers being taken. Sudzha is apparently fully under Ukrainian control. So this is that town here, where we've got some grey zone to the east. But yeah, that's fully under Ukrainian control according to Noel Reports. But the Russians are pushing back from the east in that area. And then finally, I thought this was worthy of note. A Russian Ka-52 attack helicopter pilot mistakenly fired on his own column, resulting in the loss of two 152 mil Mishta S self-propelled howitzers. Despite the incident, many Russian channels spread posts with photos claiming to have destroyed a column of 4 Ukrainian vehicles in Krivitsy Budi in Kursk region. So here we have the vehicles taken out supposedly by Ka-52 attack helicopter themselves. And yeah, more evidence of Ukrainians in Sudzha, therefore implying control over that settlement. Anyway, that's enough from me. I really appreciate your support, guys. Take care, and I'm off down the swimming pool.